Hi, everybody. Welcome to our conversation tonight with writer, producer, and SCA alum, Rahsaan Thomas. This discussion is part of the SCA Council for Diversity and Inclusion. It's called Our Voices series, in which we talk with some of our most visible alumni about their work and experiences in media. And we're in such a unique moment, both in terms of our current challenges with physical production and the widespread calls for racial and social justice, especially in policing. We're excited to gain insight into working in what seems like a paradigm shift for our industry. And I'm sure you have many questions for Aaron, our guest tonight. Our conversation will be hosted by another more recent writing alum, Derek Garlington. And if you have any questions over the course of the session, please post them in the Q&A, and we'll get to the Q&A portion after Derek and Aaron finish their conversation. So Derek, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Evan. How you doing today, Aaron?
Doing all right, Derek. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I figure I'll read your bio real quick just so people can kind of get an overview of you, and then, yeah, we'll get to chatting. So Aaron Rahsaan Thomas grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, developing a love for storytelling after completing a 5th grade assignment to create his own Greek myth from scratch. As time passed, Aaron developed his passion for storytelling visually and attended Morehouse College. Aaron would also matriculate through the University of Kansas, earning honors in English literature before moving to Los Angeles and attending the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts for graduate school. After graduating from USC, Aaron was selected for the prestigious CBS Writers Mentoring Program. Aaron began his professional career as a writer's assistant on Soul Food, the series, and went on to work on the staff of such TV shows as NBC's Friday Night Lights, for which he received the Peabody Award, as well as CBS procedurals such as Numb3rs and CSI NY. Aaron has also served as the co-executive producer of TNT's SouthLAnd, Fox's Sleepy Hollow, and Netflix The Get Down. Aaron has had 2 screenplays produced as feature films, Cover, directed by Bill Duke, and Assassination Game, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme. He has also directed an ESPN 30 for 30 film about the USC football team during the Pete Carroll era, entitled Trojan War. Aaron is currently co-creator and executive producer of the procedural series reboot of SWAT on CBS, currently in its 4th season. Okay, resume. Thank you, Aaron, so much for joining us and creating so much fantastic material. So I kind of want to just ask you first, kind of the hot question I feel like on everyone's mind these days is, how are you dealing with all the changes since March, primarily kind of COVID and this social justice uprising situation?
Well, first, I want to start, again, thank you for having me here. And it's always a pleasure to come back. I enjoyed my time at SC a lot. So it's always nice to be on this side of things because I remember being a student or an alum listening to a lot of the speakers come back. This year's been it's been an unorthodox year to say the least, 2020. And so when we talk about how things have been handled, both with COVID and with, I would say, the awakening in dealing with, the aftermath, when we're talking about George Floyd, the death of George Floyd, we're talking about Breonna Taylor and still trying to get justice for her and countless others at this point. The short answer would be you take it day by day. It's kind of a new adventure every day, a new wrinkle in any of these discussions. I am an optimist, and so at least in the business of entertainment, I think we found opportunities to try to have more mature, honest, and productive conversations coming out of all of this, a chance to really have conversations we haven't had before. And so, in the case of COVID, for instance, obviously we're talking about, a pandemic that none of us have ever seen before, the likes that none of us have ever seen before. And, it's something that affects not only the day-to-day, but we're talking about practical production. We're talking about how writing staffs meet, physical locations where we congregate, the spaces in which we create are things that we might have taken, for granted before, but now are very close considerations. We're seeing a new normal develop around us as we move. For a lot of us, at least when dealing with COVID, what we're looking at is you know, you're taking it step by step, each production looking at day by day, you know, what's the new normal when it comes to shooting scenes that before might have been intimate scenes between two characters. You know, we're looking at soap operas right now. The Bold and the Beautiful is one example. You know, when you're built on doing what normally would have been a basic two-shot of two people talking close together, two people kissing. Now, all of a sudden, these are considerations where, you know, it really does test your creativity and your ways of thinking outside of the box. In many ways, we all become producers to a certain extent because you have to find new ways to try to tell your story. You know, and that's before you even get into the practicality of, in large scale, you know, how do you do crowd scenes if you're telling an epic story? You know, are you depending more on CGI now as opposed to in person? Are you doing more virtual sets, such as the show The Mandalorian on Disney Plus? You know, so it's actually, being an optimist, I look at it, it's a way of challenging us to become more creative in our filmmaking, our storytelling, with the idea that some of this, I think, actually may revolutionize the business moving forward, even once we do find, you know, a vaccine that actually works. You know, I think some of the ways we do things, some of the things that we didn't have time to question before, now are being questioned. Do we really need as many people on set? You know, is there a system where we can stagger, you know, people a little bit more? Are there new jobs that are created because of this? You know, where we're looking after the health of our crew and staff. Now, that said, that's one part of 2020, right? That's the COVID aspect. We also have the unrest aspect, and myself having created a police procedural for CBS, and a show in particular that has an African-American militarized police officer at the center of it, and SWAT, and Shamar Moore as our star, that's been its own challenge. But I also look at that in an optimistic way, where that's allowed not only our own writing staff, but I think the industry in general to really take a magnifying glass to the way we're approaching certain storylines and ask ourselves what's the impact? How can we be part of the solution as opposed to being part of the problem, which I think for many, many years there and still are large elements of our business that contribute more to the challenges than they do to actually improving things. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but basically at the end of the day, at least the way I'm approaching it and the way we're approaching it on SWAT is to try to look for the positive ways that these elements challenge us to think differently, to think more creatively, to think outside of the box, and to try to move forward and try to improve the way we've always done things.
Thank you for that. And I guess kind of going off of that in terms of, you know, working on SWAT and that being an interesting time right now, I went back and decided to rewatch the pilot, and I thought it was almost eerie how much the pilot echoed our current times, right? I mean, this is something that didn't come too much as a surprise, but there is literally, you know, a group of people who are mad about, in that case, it was like an accidental shooting, but still the community kind of being up in arms, and the task force, you know, the SWAT team trying to figure out how to deal with that. And I thought you guys did a very interesting way of, like, you know, talking about all those and even getting into the misinformation that we deal with, you know, that goes across, you know, whether it's political lines or whatever. There's a lot of conversations that you guys had within that pilot. So I was wondering, what conversations do you feel like you've continued to have on the show as the show progressed, and what conversations would you like to be having more as you guys, you know, go into your next season?
So Derek, you know, our show SWAT, you know, I think is actually uniquely built when we're talking about, you know, cop procedurals on major networks. You know, the show, you know, and starting off that show, I created the show. The show originated for me with the idea of a character who could understand Black Lives Matter, and also any of the views that may be critical of Black Lives Matter, and that, you know, he decided to work as a police officer, but came from a neighborhood that had a love-hate relationship with police officers. So this whole idea of how police treat community, and in particular Black and brown communities, was always baked into our show from the very beginning. It was the DNA of our show. When you talk about it being timely, you know, if we're being honest, it's timeless is what it is. It's an element that has never gone away. It's just, it's like a symptom of a disease that just tends to flare up every few years, and there's a media spotlight on it. But, one of the more sobering aspects that we've reminded ourselves of when we've been talking about story ideas on SWAT is that, you go back, 28 years to 1992, and there was the Rodney King uprising. Around pretty much the same elements. Many of the quotes in the newspapers, very similar to what we're hearing in 2020. You go back 27 years before that, 1965, you had the Watts uprising. Guess where that started from? Police and community. And then you go before that and you get into the time of LA Confidential, and you want to really talk about crooked police or issues with police and community. You really get into a problematic area there. So at least in the city of Los Angeles, but really in the entire nation of, the United States, police and community has always been an element, especially when you're talking about the Black community and communities of people of color. And so the difference now and the conversations that we're having are mainly being able to be more self-aware of how we contribute to these conversations. There's an awareness now where you hope we've learned from the past. And certainly as we talk about our storylines on SWAT, we look to reference the past so that, it was kind of alarming as we were talking about, some of the things I just mentioned. There are people, writers that I know, colleagues that I know that were somehow unaware that there had been issues between police and communities of color prior to 2020, that this was not something that began and hopefully ends, I think, for some people with George Floyd, that it's an ongoing, larger systemic problem. So what our conversations have encompassed basically are, how can we tell stories that are both entertaining, but also engage our audiences, to start to look deeper, to start to ask questions that maybe didn't occur to them before. We don't so much look to try to present answers, but we do look to try to add questions that maybe some of our audience hasn't asked. And, the hope is that the communication and the conversations get better moving forward.
Thank you. I think continuing to build off that, I read your Vanity Fair article. I thought it was really brilliant. So thank you for sharing your words in such an eloquent way. And I kind of wanted to touch on something that I thought was important is you talked about this kind of use of universal, we talk about universal storytelling all the time. Like you wanted to touch your whole audience, but sometimes that universal storytelling can kind of turn into a blanket slate where we're losing nuance. And especially when it comes to like Black and brown communities, it seems that sometimes we have a pretty small imagination as to what storylines those characters could play. So I was wondering, with that kind of fantasy that is often played, sometimes called, propaganda, one scenario I think of, which you touched on in the article, is the fact that we're getting a lot of bad boy cops these days. And those bad boy cops sometimes bend the law in order to enforce the law. And that immediately makes me think of Breonna Taylor, where they, had a no-knock warrant and they break in, according to the law, that wasn't illegal, but those type of things are things we're kind of used to seeing on TV, having to break into somebody's house to get the villain. And I'm just wondering, with this kind of propaganda thing that's going on, you say you're having some more of these new conversations. What do you think about that specific aspect? You kind of already talked a little bit about the history of it, but that aspect that comes with America and the world being used to watching cops is always these guys that if something goes wrong, it's for a reason. Like even, and I love the pilot, but even in your pilot, like it has to be that it was an accident. I feel like it never is like, maybe the cops were intentionally or just weren't that great of people. And I'm just wondering, like, how do you think we can kind of adjust to this whole propaganda thing that we've done for decades and decades?
Well, it's a multi-layered question. I'll start with the short answer. The short answer for me is really to expand the type of storytellers who are telling the stories, to expand the point of view on the story. With that, I believe that you'll get different types of characters, different treatments of the subject matter, different life experiences infusing into the types of stories that you would see. I'm a fan of almost all genres. And what I would say when I tell people when they're particularly critical of cop procedurals is that the problem of representation doesn't begin and end with police procedurals. You know, you have the same problem with superhero shows, you have the same problem with zombie shows, you have the same problem with fantasy shows. They all have a representation problem. It's just that police procedurals have a more immediate effect on life and death right now, you know, in this moment. Across the board, in theory, if you want to tell the best, freshest stories, then you want, I would think, different life experiences, different points of view, different backgrounds to be able to come together to add to the spice of life that you would have, if that truly is your goal. So, you know, so there's that aspect. You know, I would say when it comes to, you know, propaganda and when it comes to kind of like, you know, what can be done about all of that, you know, ultimately what you're looking to do, you know, is you're keeping in mind that just like there are different outlets and different networks and different audiences, you know, there are different treatments on subject matter. You know, the number one name of the game normally is in all phases is to entertain. And so, you know, is there room to tell stories, different types of stories and still entertain? I would say always, yes. You know, for me, the enemy is not so much the idea that a cop is represented as a hero, because I think there are, in real life, there are police officers who are heroes. So much so is if that is exclusively and pretty much consistently the only image that we get, then the message is sent that that is what reality is, and that's not true to reality. So a greater variety, in my opinion, would help to advance that conversation a lot. Instead of seeing 99% of cop shows being about the same type of police officers who, you know, are considered infallible for the most part, is there room to tell stories where that's not always the case? Is there room to tell stories where certainly police officers are fallible? Yes, we're in the age of peak television. There's over 520 shows at this point. If we can have 3 different representations of the Joker in the last 25 years, we can definitely have different representations of what a police officer is. And that starts a lot of times with who's telling the stories. You know, what are the different takes on a police officer? You know, that means diversifying the levels of content creators. You know, when we have people coming out of film school, we have people that are getting jobs. You know, who are the people that are allowed to tell these narratives, you know, and that also goes to diversifying the ranks of the people who greenlight these projects. I think by diversifying on those 2 levels, the people with the power to greenlight projects and the people who have the creative vision to create content, then with every genre across the board and also with police procedurals, I think you will see different types of stories that are told.
Definitely. I think representation is obviously kind of top of the line in terms of getting different stories. You need different perspectives. So
one thing I would also add that I was going to forget in a second is that, in my opinion, the police procedural is not going anywhere. It's also not a recent phenomenon. If you look at the history of Hollywood from the very beginning, they weren't called police procedurals, but they were Westerns at one point. You know, you had the square-jawed, normally white sheriff who rode in. There were the others. Back then, they were Native Americans. We got to get rid of them. We got to impose law and order. And that narrative tends to evolve over time. You know, it's into the 50s when you get into Dragnet, into the 60s, the 70s when you get into Dirty Harry. You look at the career of Clint Eastwood. You know, you can see kind of how the lawman has progressed from cowboy to urban city cop, so on and so forth. It's a narrative that's been with us for the entire length of Hollywood. So the question is how can we take this narrative that's always been with us and revolutionize it, expand it, be more ambitious with it?
Thank you for that answer. And it gives me kind of like 2 jumping points. I kind of want to talk about story and then also the people telling the story. And I read this part in the article, so feel free to correct me if any of this information is wrong, but I read that, you know, someone who was kind of well known in the police procedural world, Craig Gore, had been fired for some comments that he made about lighting up protesters, apparently. And I've had some situations, you know, where you have to work on set with people who don't share your same views, but you guys are pretty friendly and get the job done. But you know, if certain topics come up, like it's going to get awkward and weird. And I'm just wondering, you having worked in a lot of different situations, and I guess at one time, you know, also worked with Craig Gore, how do you manage situations where you maybe know that someone, you know, your ideals don't quite match up, because they shouldn't always, you know, that's how we get good stories, is having different viewpoints. But how do you work with someone when, you know, for especially when it comes to this situation, it's not a matter of just opinion, because I feel like, you know, sometimes people love to just play mental chess with subjects, and racism is the most annoying subject to me to play mental chess with, because it's not just this game of like, I'm right or you're right. It's like, this is my life. So I'm just wondering how you handle those type of situations. I'm sure it probably come up in the cop procedural world if, you know, people view cops a certain way and you want to be a little more nuanced about it. How do you navigate those kind of situations? Especially
Yeah, it's a good question. I first want to clarify that, at least in the case of Craig Gore, he was no longer on our staff when he was fired. He was fired from the Law and Order spinoff by Dick Wolf. But certainly he was staffed on our show for the first 3 seasons of SWAT. You know, what I would say to when you're working with people, you know, that don't always show the best judgment, and sometimes have character flaws, you know, when it comes to a variety of different elements, whether it's racism, sexism, classism, many isms. A lot of it comes back to really, you know, speaking your own truth, figuring out a way for you to, you know, you determine on an individual basis, you know, what are the lines that you've drawn? What are the lines, ethical lines that you feel very important about? I think on an individual basis, we all maybe have slightly different standards for what we feel is out of bounds. What is universal is the idea that more and more we're fighting for voices to be heard, period. You know, for you not to have your voice taken away from you simply because you don't come from a certain background that perhaps your industry is not used to. And this is universal. This is not just Hollywood. This is almost every industry in the United States. When you're talking about a person of color, fortunately, more and more, I think people are being more outspoken and having these conversations in public, and it's not as taboo. You no longer have to feel as though you're alone in the way that you might have in the past. And so hopefully that gives more truth to power as far as being able to have honest conversations. So a lot of it starts from there, coming in, going in, knowing what your own standards are, knowing what you feel strongly about, and also being able to, I think, effectively communicate that. You know, and then also keeping in mind, and that's one of the things that's always a struggle, is we're in an industry that has had a glacial pace when it comes to progress. And so one of the things that I think a lot of my contemporaries, and certainly, you know, a lot of the professionals and the successful people that came before me had to weigh is, you know, what are the battles worth fighting and what is the war that I'm waging? You know, because on any given day, almost every day, waking up, going into the office, there are going to be microaggressions that you might face even before you get to work. And you always have to weigh for yourself, what are the battles that are worth fighting? And, you know, what are the battles that, at least for now, you know, it may be worth putting on the back burner? You know, what are the battles that actually count towards the overall war, the overall goal, so to speak? In my case, what I've always tried to weigh is, you know, when I come across something in my own path, is this affront purely to my ego, or is this an affront to people who look and approach things the way I do with my background? Is this a fight that I need to fight not only for me, but for others? Or is this simply an individual who's being an idiot who I can ignore and, you know, and kind of brush aside? And it's not always an easy judgment, you know, but in Hollywood, certainly as a professional of color and as an artist of color, you know, you're faced with those decisions pretty much every 15 minutes. You know, I heard somebody tell a stupid joke. Do I want to confront this person right now and let them know everything that I feel about that joke? Or is there a better way to do that? You know, is there a way where I can gain more leverage, power, stature, where when it's my time where I can control the environment more, I can just decide there's none of those jokes that are going to be told, you know? Or do I put it all on the line right now, confront that person, and maybe I get satisfaction out of that? But there are always ripple effects with any of that when you're especially in an industry where you're still trying to make, you know, inroads. So it's not an easy question to answer, and there's not a right or wrong. We're figuring it out as we go, each of us as individuals. But the one thing I can say is that you want to make sure that you are clear about what your voice is, and you want to make sure that you're heard, especially when you need to be heard.
That's a really insightful answer. Thank you. And to kind of speak to that, because yeah, you know, like those microaggressions happening, you have to choose with battle. And I think with this current state, while I believe, you know, most of us really enjoy our experience at USC, there's been a certain situation that's come up where people are voicing some of their woes. And that's come through the form of this thing called Black at USC. It's an Instagram page, which has very quickly gained a lot of traction. I think it went up about 2 weeks ago and it has almost 12,000 followers, 500 posts. And it's basically those microaggressions and sometimes bigger than microaggressions that we talk about, that we face every day. And Black students have been posting, some non-Black students too, but just posting situations that they've seen, either racism, microaggressions, and things like that. And it's gotten the attention of Carol Folt, you know, our president at USC, and it's definitely been made aware of. And I find, because, you know, I'm still very much so connected to a lot of the students, they're speaking up, and there is kind of this continued, sometimes irritation that you hear, you know, things will get better, but it often feels like lip service, because as you mentioned, sometimes things move at a glacial pace. And, you know, I just see some students kind of getting discouraged, and it can be an uphill battle. And you spoke to that, but I was wondering, where do you kind of gain, someone who's been through the business, and I want to ask you some of the questions about the start of your career, but someone who's kind of been through the business, how have you gained kind of, I guess, the stamina for this? Because as we mentioned, it's a generational thing. We are not the first generation or the second or the third generation to deal with oppression or microaggressions. And I'm wondering, how do you gain how do you got that stamina to keep going and sometimes picking your battles? Like, you spoke to it a little bit, but I'm just curious about the stamina piece as well, when it feels like you've been doing it for a very long time.
Yeah, I was going to add to that, or the fourth, or the fifth generation, or the sixth generation, or the seventh. You go back far enough, of course. I mean, what can I say? You know, a lot of inspiration I tend to get from the people who came before me, whether it was either in the industry itself, or from my family members, or from friends. You know, the question is, as always, when you're talking about, you know, battles in the war, so to speak, is, you know, do you believe your art, your craft is something worth fighting for? Do you believe that, you know, being able to tell the stories that you love is worth fighting for? If the answer is no, well, then that kind of takes care of itself. You go and do something else. But if the answer is yes, if you truly love what we do and you love the craft and you enjoy it, I do, then that's where you find the stamina. You know, you love telling stories, you love collaborating with people. You know, you fight for your ability to do this. You know, it's not just about a paycheck. It's not just a job. You know, where does that come from? I don't know. You know, that's something that I think a lot of us are born with, a desire to artistically express ourselves. And so a lot of this for me is not just about social justice. It really is a love for the craft and wanting the craft to be as immersive, expansive as possible. I'm a sports fan as well, and the way I look at it is there was a time in Major League Baseball where things were segregated. There were only certain types of players that were allowed to play. Game was okay, you know, I suppose, but it seemed to get so much better once, you know, the floodgates were kind of open up to different people participating. And that's the way I feel on the art side, is that, you know, if you really love great stories, you love great filmmaking, you love great TV series, then, you know, the idea of opening those storytelling avenues to different types of people, I would think would get you excited. There's so many different possibilities for different ways to tell stories, different characters we haven't seen, different twists and turns. Just different life experiences that, for me, that's where the energy comes from, is the possibilities. That's exciting. You know, projects I've not seen yet that I know are still out there because they haven't been done. You know, just the idea of innovation, whether it's technology, you know, whether it's music, you know, Ennio Morricone just passed away, you know, a day or two ago. I love his music. You know, I don't know what the African-American version of that is, but I know that person's coming, you know, at some point. When that great composer comes, you know, that's going to be awesome. You know, like the possibility of that for me keeps me going, and that's always worth fighting for.
That really invigorated me, man. That's a beautiful answer, and I think a lot of us storytellers feel the same way. We just want to see the best nuanced stories, and every generation our stories get a little bit more clever. You know, before this talk, before we got in here, you're talking about your niece, I think, who was on TikTok, and she's not even a filmmaker, and she's like, you know, going back and forth with the camera and learning things. So I think that's it. You know, we just want to continue to see better stories. So we gotta, if you really want to see those stories, we gotta, you know, continue to fight to see those more diverse stories. So with that, I want to reel it on back to like where you started, because that was a really cool story that I felt like I got a vague sense of like, man, this man has really been about storytelling and moved. So I know you kind of got a jump started in your career in the CBS Writers Mentorship Program. So I wanted to know what your experience like that was. And I know this was a general program, but I am kind of just making sure to touch on some of the issues that, you know, our students and people of color are kind of dealing with, since that's the topic. I wanted to know, because I also, as I was looking at programs and stuff, I know yours wasn't particularly a diversity program, but I wanted you to speak to maybe as well those experiences, because I know some people are a little tentative that often leads to a little bit of stagnation. So I was wondering about your own experience with the CBS mentorship program and what suggestion you would have for people applying, and maybe some things to look out for, whether the program is worth it or not, type of thing.
So here would be my views on the writing programs. I'm a big proponent, and I'll tell you why. You know, prior to the writing programs, when we talk about a business that tends to be built on who you know, for people and creators of color, writers of color in particular, directors of color as well, the idea of knowing enough people to actually get a foothold in the industry was 10, 100,000 times harder than, you know, if you also happen to share the same ethnic background or cultural background. So what I have felt the writing programs have provided, certainly I've benefited from that, is the idea of putting you in the room with people that you wouldn't ordinarily have access to. Meaning that, you know, certainly my experience with the CBS program was such that, you know, I was able to, it's kind of a finishing school is the way I look at it. You know, I learned my craft at SC, but, you know, certain aspects of the business I was able to learn through the writing programs. You know, I had mock interviews with showrunners. What that allowed me to do was actually mess up without real life consequences. You know, I didn't have my first showrunner meeting when it was the first opportunity to get a job. I was able to actually, in the confines of a safe environment, be able to work on what is it to speak to an executive? What is it to speak to fellow writers? What is it to network? You know, all of those types of things. Not everybody needs it. Some people come to film school already prepared for that. But for those who can benefit from that, I think there's a great opportunity there. So there is an educational aspect. Now, you know, when we talk about access to actual jobs, I think a lot of the criticism that's come the way of writing programs has been really based on the idea that they're not be-all end-alls. You know, the writing programs, in essence, under the best case scenarios, may provide as feeder programs to certain shows under certain network or studio umbrellas. And so what I found is that they tend to be greatly successful at placing the writer on their first step, meaning just getting them, a lot of times, the interview perhaps, or, you know, giving them the support that they may need to get employment. That said, what's missing, I think, is not so much from the writing programs, it's supplemental programs. It can't be just the writing programs. It's got to be and, you know, and what else? And ellipses, meaning that once writers are on staff, it's not just important to roster writers of color, but they have to be championed as well. You know, it's like dropping a fresh cadet, you know, out of boot camp into the middle of a war. And if there's not someone there to at least kind of like be a support, help them fight shoulder to shoulder with them, they may wither on the vine. You know, I'm mixing up analogies, but I think you know what I mean. So my preference would be is while the writing programs have been decent feeder, you know, programs getting people into the pipeline, there's still a whole infrastructure that's missing that allows the writer of color to actually move up that pipeline, to give them the advice on how to navigate microaggressions, for instance, that are very specific to the path of the writer of color or the storyteller of color or the director of color or the editor of color or the actor of color. What do you do when you're facing microaggressions every 15 minutes from your superiors, as well as meaning people that have more power than you at least, or from your colleagues? That is something that's been missing, and that's something that right now, as we're having more ambitious conversations, when we're talking about practical solutions, that's something I think would help a ton, is who are the professionals that can help to champion storytellers of color as they matriculate through the system. Because without having that, introducing people to the fray, like I said, is basically offering them up to the hounds, you know, so to speak. And that's when we talk about like whether it's considered a scarlet letter, or whether it's, you know, or whether there's a question as to how much success, you know, do graduates actually get once they go through and seem not to make it up the ranks. All of those questions begin and end with the idea of who's championing them. Are they put in positions to actually succeed? Are there people following up on things that they could improve on or watch out for, or just learn to navigate? You know, these are all things that if the industry is serious about supporting, you know, voices of color, these are the things that you would want to look at. So my suggestion would be is to add on, is to look at what else can we do instead of expecting the writer feeder programs to do everything. You know, look at them for what they are. They tend to do their job. The things that we're missing are the, you know, it's the infrastructure beyond that.
Thank you. And that kind of leads into my next question. And I have about 2 or 3 more, and then I'm going to turn it over to our audience for questions as well. But that kind of leads directly into my next question, because, okay, you start at the bottom and we're kind of tracking with your career too. So, you know, you do CBS and then you start to be a beginning writer and then you're moving on to, you know, let's say like mid-level. And I thought it was really cool. You spoke at the project that the Peabody Project put together with diverse representation, which was the Black Television and Film Professional Town Hall, which I found super insightful. I have a group of creatives I meet with, and it felt really cool because it felt like we came to the meeting, and then it felt like y'all who are like 2 to 3, 4 steps ahead, like y'all were having the same kind of meeting we have, and it was just really cool to witness that. And it was interesting to hear like some similar conversations that happen kind of at mid-level. It seems like a lot of writers of color, especially once you get to mid-level, it's like you're trying to get that step up and you just can't quite get that promotion to the next position. So with that being said, I was wondering if you could kind of summarize what happened with the town hall and what, you know, you guys who are working in that collective, I'm not sure if, you know, you're just coming for I think you're continuing to work together as well, but what kind of purpose you saw from the town hall that you kind of want to push forward. And I think that'll kind of mix into that mid-level writer thing, because that was kind of new to me. Most of my friends are kind of still, you know, starting out. So it's interesting to hear those conversations of like mid-level writers. So, you know, the objective of the town hall moving forward and that conversation.
Right. Well, here's the thing. It's like, I feel like, you know, the generation of film school graduates coming out are so light years ahead of where we were back in my day, you know, when we were figuring things out kind of real time. You know, what we were talking about in essence, in general, is elements of the answer that I gave before, which are ways to champion storytellers of color up the pipeline, you know, to not leave individuals alone to their own devices, but how can we help each other, you know, navigate what can be treacherous waters a lot of times, you know. Some of us had to kind of figure it out through trial and error. And one of the things that we're looking at is, how can we pass down knowledge, share knowledge really, with, laterally as well as vertically, for the best ways to, continue to work as much as possible. So, when it comes to that, that means, how are we able to expand our networks? How can we be champions for each other? How can we, when we're looking for it, a lot of times it's not, as hard as it is to get a job in this industry, especially for a storyteller of color, it's equally as difficult, if not more, to really find the right type of job. The job in a location, a place, on a project with the group, where there will be support and there will be, in essence, professional love, where you'll be able to flourish, learn, gain more skills. There have been artists in the past, many of whom have learned it the hard way, where you land in the wrong place, the wrong project, the wrong crew, the wrong writing staff, and it can do more damage than good, even though you're paying your bills. It can kill the creative spirit. It can convince you that the business is not a place maybe that you want to work and, and apply your trade. And so for the writers of color who are coming out now, in essence, it's looking at how can we improve our own community, help each other out, and try to at least pave, roads that may be more conducive to success, may, be prepared in ways that we haven't had before, to give you the support that you need. Because again, it's not just enough to get employed, it's getting employed in spaces where you will be championed. I can't stress that enough. So, if I were starting my career today, something I didn't know when I was just getting started is that it would be just as important to me as to where the job offer is coming from. Who are the people I would be working with? Do they have a track record at all of being supportive to anyone of color? And if they don't, are they actually dedicated to that? If they're not, then it may be lip service, and you at least know going in, they're, the challenges may be more intense than, in other places where I may have more support. If that makes any sense.
That makes so much sense. I've only been able to really figure that out for myself recently. I was trying to figure out what the feeling in my stomach was when I graduated, and I'm like, cool, opportunities. But I was like, why don't I feel super excited for all of them? And it was finally the analogy came to my mind that I don't want to climb a ladder that when I get to the top and look around, I'm not in the room that I wanted to be in. We talk about climbing the ladder, but if it's the wrong ladder and I end up somewhere, I'm like,
And by the way, that's if you're fortunate. There are times where, you get on the wrong ladder and you're climbing the ladder and you realize that people have been cutting the spokes off of the ladder as you've been trying to climb. And that's why you're on the same two steps for however many years. So much of it comes down to advanced research a lot of times. And that also comes down to staying in touch with your colleagues, whether that's your fellow graduates, whether those are artists that you trust, whether those are mentors that you've been fortunate enough to connect with. Do your research on where the job offerings are and what the track record tends to be, particularly with your own background, whether that's, what's their track record been with gender? What's their track record been with people of color? What's their track record been with supporting people that are similar to you, in essence? You have to know that these days. And that's, when you're talking about setting yourself up to be successful, that's a big part of it.
Thank you. That's super, super helpful, I think, to everyone. And I've got my last question, and then we'll turn it over. So it's a last question / maybe a little baby pitch for just like an interesting idea. I just want somebody to do it. But so we talk about, just kind of getting back to the police part and police procedurals and things of that nature. And there's kind of this call to, defund the police. And whether you agree with it or not, I think we can all agree that we could have a little bit more imagination when it comes to how things are taken care of. One that keeps coming up, and I would love to watch the show about this, is like social workers who actually work with, people who have mental health issues, who are homeless, who I don't really see that narrative. Or someone brought to my mind that I didn't even know this was a thing, but there's a job called an interventionist, who often are old gang members who get paid to go into their neighborhood and clean them up, because they actually know where the actual problems are and how to talk to some of these people without, you know, starting issues. Or one that was interesting to me is just like the idea of a community guardian who grew up in the community, and it's almost like, you know, you grow up in that community, then you take care of that community, and then you actually go to a jury of your peers instead of being random people who actually know you, who can make a judgment on whether you should be rehabilitated, and maybe instead of a prison, a house that you live in a neighborhood. And the reason I keep thinking about these things is the idea of reimagining comes to mind. And Kendrick Sampson actually, who, you know, is in Juneteenth and Insecure, with Bill Power, he brought it up in a city council meeting that I thought was really interesting. He was like, we are in the biggest place of people with imagination. Hollywood is full of people with imagination. If y'all need help imagining a better future, we're right here. But when I think of a lot of movies that think about the future, they're either dystopian, zombies, technology's killing us. I don't really see a movie where it's like, this is, especially for people of color, where it's like, this is a nice future. Like, that doesn't really exist. And I'm just wondering, you know, where do you think there's space for those movies? Do you think in TV, do you think we might see a little bit more of that, of reimagining some of these things? That's my last question / pitch to you. And I'm just curious on your own creative brain, what you think of that, you know, in that kind of space.
I mean, I think to answer your question in general, there's more room now to tell different stories than there ever have been, because there's more demand for content than there ever has been. There's more outlets to tell stories. Stories will be told slightly differently, you know, budgets will be a little bit different, but, you know, again, we have over 500 different TV series that are currently on the air. Is there room to tell different types of futuristic stories? Is there room to tell stories about alternative ways of, you know, of establishing law enforcement? Certainly, you know, much of that comes down to the same elements that have always been there, which, you know, what's the concept? What are you trying to say with it? Is it entertaining? You know, all of those types of things. Is it right for a particular audience or perceived audience, so to speak? That said, you know, I've always been in favor of expanding the choices as opposed to looking to eliminating certain genres. I'm actually a fan, despite all of the criticisms that are legit about police procedurals. I'm actually a fan still of good police procedurals. What I see with it, though, are possibilities to expand the types of stories that are told within each genre. So within the genre of police procedurals, you know, have we seen enough alternatives to how policing could be done? No. You know, yeah, there's room for a lot of different stories to be told about that. You know, have we seen different types of stories from different types of storytellers? Absolutely not. You know, is there room to do different types of you know, futuristic jury, you know, stories about the judicial system? Yes, you know. But a lot of that comes down to having conversations that continuously, you know, put out the possibilities of those things. You know, I think what happens is, you know, Hollywood, when we're talking about investing a lot of money and a lot of time into projects, you know, the hardest thing a lot of times for especially people that green light, you know, these projects, if you want to keep your job, is to take a chance on the new, you know. But that's also an opportunity for greatness, you know. And so a big part of it always is to continue the push, the fight, to continue to you know, to expand the bounds of the stories that can be told, to get people in position to pitch those stories, to try to tell those stories. I look at it as again, it's and ellipses as opposed to eliminate one for another. I think we can build on what we've already had. We have opportunities for that. And that's where conversations I think that we're having like right now in the ether are very valuable, because it's to remind ourselves always that there's so many different other possibilities. You know, the idea of being fearful, being conservative, therefore, in the way we invest our money into projects also can have real life or death consequences in the real world, where we're kind of staying in the rut of telling the same type of story over and over again for fear of people losing jobs and businesses losing money, which are considered concerns, by the way. But certainly, you know, with so many different types of audiences to grab and so many different types of avenues, there seems to be more than enough room and possibility to expand on all of that and people still to be able to make business off of it.
Thank you. Spoken like a true optimist, and I like it. I'm an optimist too, so I will take it. And I'll take that as a challenge to continue to tell more complex stories and get them on screen so we can have more complex lives. So thank you. We're gonna go to the audience. One thing I did want to just say real quick, but I didn't want to take up any more time. I'm such a big fan of Sleepy Hollow, and I have so many questions about Sleepy Hollow. I loved that show, but I'm out of my time, so we're gonna pass it on. Maybe I'll bother you offline or something because I love that show.
Yeah, let's talk, Derek. I'll tell you all about it.
Awesome, I would love that. Let's get to these questions for now. Thank you for that. I think if we want to turn it over to Alexis first, she had the first question. So.
So what I'm going to do really quickly, when we have questions, I will allow the people to be able to turn on their video and also their mics to ask the question. If anybody who hasn't asked a question, or posted in the Q&A, if you want to do that, just put it in the Q&A and let us know if you want to be on camera, and we'll get through all the questions. So thanks.
Hi, Erin. Thank you for coming. This has been great. And when you talked about the ellipses, I have sort of a question about the ampersand in your career, because it seems like you've been able to tackle, comedy, drama. Sleepy Hollow is sort of fantasy. But my main question is about documentary, and 30 for 30 is one of my all-time favorite series ever. And I was interested in how you ended up directing and producing Trojan War, which is fantastic, and what that transition is like, going from, your career had been mostly fiction before that point. And so what is it like to transition into documentary and then go back out into fiction again?
Great question, Alexis. And I mean, much of it, a lot of it comes down to the training that I received from SC as a filmmaker, being at SC, and also had experience as a cameraman working in live news. But in essence, where I got the opportunity from is that early on in my career, I was fortunate enough to write on a show, Friday Night Lights, that was on NBC at the time. And during that time, there was a time where Friday Night Lights didn't have the biggest audience to start with. And so there was a discussion at one point about possibly switching Friday Night Lights from NBC, where our audience wasn't large enough, to different outlets. One of those outlets happened to be ESPN, at the time where they were considering doing scripted fare. And I was put in touch with executives at ESPN at the time, and we had stayed in touch. There's an old friend of mine who works at ESPN, and we'd always talked about things, if there's a project we could do together, what would it be? I became, like you, a huge fan of their 30 for 30 series, but in all honesty, I had no idea that I would ever get to do one. I was a big fan of watching them and the way those stories were told and tying in social elements with sports. That's right up my alley. That's an extension of what we did on Friday Night Lights. And so I think I'd expressed it enough to them that I was a fan that at least occurred to them, and certainly to the people that I knew well there, that I would be an interesting storyteller for one of their projects in particular. They knew that I have a passion for USC, for the film school, and for the football team in particular. And so they approached me with a very specific project, feeling as though I would be a fit for that project. Keyshawn Johnson, who was a great SC football player, wide receiver, had an idea to do a story about the Pete Carroll era at SC. And I looked at it as an opportunity to tell the story of how SC, when it comes to entertainment, is all tied together. To this day, Heritage Hall, which is the football hall, is right next door to the film school, the School of Cinematic Arts, I should say. And so I felt like there was an opportunity to tell that story of how they go hand in hand. You know, it's no accident that many of the most prominent SC football players also dabbled in acting for film because of the proximity to Hollywood. Long story short is it ended up being one of the most enjoyable artistic experiences of my life. And the difference in the documentary making that I found is it's kind of the reverse of writing fictional, you know, television. In fictional television, the hardest part a lot of times is you're sitting in front of a screen that's blank and you have to write at some point, fade in, scene one, now what's gonna happen, right? With documentaries, I felt like it was the opposite. You know, the story was already there. I just need to get out of its way, listen. You know, what are people telling us as we interview them? You might head off with one idea for what you think the story is. And then as you're hearing people talk about things, the story may take you in a slightly different direction. And you have to be open to that. It's kind of like surfing, I guess, in a way. Are you, you know, do you have the balance and are you flexible enough to kind of be able to let the story guide you and to shape it into what, you know, what it is? It tells you, you know, as opposed to the other way around. But I enjoyed it immensely. When I look at it now, it's not only a film that I'm proud of and it's a series that I'm proud of. You know, they've made OJ Made in America, which I thought was one of the best films I've seen in the last few years. I still love things like The Two Escobars, which was season 1. You know, they obviously, it wasn't a 30 for 30 technically, but the latest Jordan doc on, you know, The Last Dance with the Bulls, I thought was fantastic. But the way I look at the film that I did is it's not only a film that I'm proud of and a series that I'm proud of, but it's also kind of a capsule from my experience at USC Film School. I was able to interview some of my former, you know, professors that are in that film. Ted Braun from the writing department, Ty Boyd from, you know, from everywhere. John Singleton, the late John Singleton, we were able to interview him. So for me, we were able to get Larry Turman from, you know, the Stark program. It'll always have a special place in my heart because of that personally. You know, I was also able to produce it with, you know, colleagues of mine, Malik Aziz, who was a graduate of the Stark program. Few different people that were all graduates, almost the entire, you know, behind the scenes staff, you know, so it's a lot of fun. In many ways, it's kind of a full circle moment, one of those rare full circle moments that you get. And so I'm glad you asked about it because it certainly, whenever I think about it, I always think about it really fondly.
I was so excited to see John Singleton and Todd Boyd in it. It was really cool because most of those 30 for 30 don't have the sort of academics coming in and talking.
Yeah, no, we approached it that way in that we really want to, in part, tribute the film school as much as the football team, you know, with the idea that they're both under that umbrella of entertainment titans, you know, in the city of Los Angeles. And also, I mean, you know, layers upon layers, it was very important to me that I grabbed as many people of color from my experience at SC. You know, we had Michael B. Jordan, you know, narrate the film. This is before Killmonger, so we could still afford him. But it was very important for me to also add that layer of what was it to be a student of color at SC in particular. So, you know, it is a special time capsule for me. And certainly I think about that whole process very fondly.
Thank you so much for making it. And thanks for that analogy about surfing. I think that's something to really think about. Yeah.
No, it's a different way of storytelling. And ultimately, again, if, you know, there's a belief in the craft, it's a way to stretch the muscles. You know, I hadn't done a documentary like that before, but it forced me to kind of think about getting into a story in a different way. And conversely, you know, especially getting into post editing, you know, thinking about the pieces of music that I want to choose. When I went back to the scripted world, it allowed me to also have more, you know, more options for editing in that world as well and telling stories. So it you know, ultimately it all helps towards building the craft, maturing the craft.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I believe we only have like 2 more. So do you have time for, I know it's at 7. Do you have time for 2 more questions?
I got time for whatever. So
thanks, Aaron.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. I believe next up was C. Craig, good friend of mine. Come on, C. Craig.
Hey, how's it going?
Going all right. How are you?
I'm all right. Thank you so much for doing this. It means the world to us, and it's been extremely helpful. The question I had was looking at what's happening in the world right now and how big a deal what we're going through in 2020 is. Like, how do you differentiate or decide when it's time to talk about what we're going through right now versus a vision for the future, right, in your work, and deciding what type of story you want to tell next? Like, do you continue to speak on what's happening now, or you start looking ahead?
Are you saying everything in general or the unrest in particular?
Yeah, well, the unrest in particular, yes.
Okay. I mean, every artist is a different approach, but certainly I found it to be helpful and cathartic to address the issues of the moment. That said, it's not that you're not looking ahead, but part of it is based on what your approach to your project and material are. What type of story are you telling? In the case of SWAT, we've always tried to tell a story that is current day, is pretty current with events, but is not ripped from the headlines, meaning that we're not trying to grab every newspaper headline and make that into a story like the traditional Law and Order series or SVU. We tell a story that's in a slightly parallel universe where everything's pretty much the same, but there are fictional events that occur. And a lot of those fictional events are very much informed by what's going on in our everyday life. So, when we started off the series with a black kid getting shot by a white cop, accidentally, all of those characters are fueled by the same past knowledge that we've had. They lived in a world where there was Rodney King. They lived in a world where there was Watts. They lived in a world where you had, Eric Garner and, a lot of situations that we've seen. So for that particular project, very much infused by what's going on right now today. I was in a writer's room earlier today before I stepped on to here, and some of the things we're talking about right now are things that are happening in the year 2020. What are the elements, the challenges that we're facing? What are the challenges to people of color? What are the challenges of police? What are the challenges to police of color right now? If it were a different project, if I were telling a story about futuristic police, then the approach might be different. I think Watchmen, for instance, had a little bit of that challenge of, or Westworld. Westworld has that challenge to a greater extent of trying to anticipate perhaps what the problems might be,
right,
in the future. But when you get into a little bit of fantasy sci-fi, that requires a different way of approaching your premises, right? You are, in essence, you're researching, and to a certain extent, to a large extent, you are making guesstimates as to what, we might be afflicted by. 9 times out of 10, these are timeless issues. The issue of class is not going around and not going away anytime. The issue of tensions between groups of people is as old as human beings. What the specifics are may change in the future, but we have a long way to evolve, if we ever will, past, personal differences between tribes and groups. And so there's certain things that I think are universal, no matter the premise.
Listen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe we have 2 more questions. Ellie, I believe that's how you say it. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but she should be up next. And actually, I think she's in that last one.
What, Haley?
Haley.
Yeah, I had to do it just to say hello to you. How are you, Aaron? It was such
all right.
I really, really enjoyed it so much. Derek, I just have to say thank you for your great questions. So many times I would write something and you would already ask Aaron, so it was fantastic.
No problem, I'm glad.
My questions were two questions. I don't want to keep everyone, but one, I recently saw that a lot of showrunners, Terry Kopp, for example, went to Twitter to talk about some of the past actions of unconscious bias and racism. And do you think that that's effective for more people to just go out and start outing themselves and being more accountable in that way? Or, and then, yeah, so I could take this one over.
I have my optimistic answer and I got my cynical answer.
Okay, cool.
So my optimistic answer is, seems to be coming from a good place, I think, and if that allows showrunners to think about things, try to think about things in a more open-minded way, then I'm all for it. That's great. The cynical side of me hopes that it's not an attempt to avoid cancel culture, where you're trying to get out ahead and just offer people, here are my skeletons, so you don't have to go digging for them. So don't come here, don't at me, don't, that kind of thing. Which in the past, Hollywood's been known to do. It's like, all right, you guys, people of color, you're making noise. Let me throw you a bone. Let me give Denzel an Oscar or whatever, now shut up for a couple of years. And I really, really hope that's not the case this time. The only way to tell really is to see how we progress, what actions are made. When we look up, not so much in like 4 months, but when we look up in 4 years, has there been a real dent? The statistics, when we're talking about percentages of people of color doing different jobs, have stayed pretty stubbornly consistent for a long time. So it kind of doesn't matter what people say. It's nice. What do you do? Like when you go to hire for your next show, are you hiring differently? Are you considering a wider berth of candidates? Tell me that. For me personally, and it's the same thing with canceling shows, right? It's not so much about handing the pound of flesh to the public. We cancel cops, we cancel whatever. Okay, cool. What are the next shows you're developing? And are you approaching that in a different way, smarter way, hopefully, than you have in the past? If you are not, then there's not really much that's changed. You had a moment where you wanted to bond with people and admitted, hey, I recognize my failings, and then you did nothing about your failings.
Correct. Do you, just to that point, do you feel like the incentivization of like people of colors and writers' room has kind of come to a bad effect in terms of them staying at lower levels and people realizing, oh great, I can get a diversity hire for free, but then it kind of pigeonholes and kind of makes them feel like they are less than? And those are my two questions.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword when it comes to the minority slot on shows. That's actually the B side of the writing program question that Derek had earlier. It absolutely can be a scarlet letter a lot of times, where writers, colleagues can, it's the age-old affirmative action debate, age-old meaning since the 70s, I suppose, but like that debate about, does it mark you as special and somehow like not as capable? But I gotta admit, if the alternative to that is not hiring any people of color, then I don't care. As long as there are writers of color getting in there. What I feel like there has to be is a follow-up. Are they being championed once they're there? If they're being tossed into a show, and that show is a show where you're labeled as the writer of color, and the showrunner sees you as quote unquote free labor, and it's been made clear that somehow you're there taking someone else's spot and you don't deserve it, then that's not a great place to be. That's the failing. To me, it's not the diversity slot that's the failing, it's the perception of the environment that you're in. And so we can do a better job probably looking at where these writers land, and then also how do we champion them once they're there, so that you're not on an island. You're not simply the person sitting in the corner with a scarlet letter on your chest, where you're set up to fail, and then if once that happens, and it's happened before, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy where people can point to so many writers of color didn't make it. And what's not necessarily mentioned that's in smaller print is because they were set up to fail, because in each of those places coming in the door from day one, they were seen as either liabilities or simply dead weight, or maybe, an extra appendage, at best. That's not always the case. It's not always the case, but the fact is, it's like, we want to look at these situations, be more critical, scrutinize them more, look to see if we can place people where there's more professional love than there has been in the past. And without that second part, you're just tossing people to the wolves.
Right.
They may survive, you might miss a limb or two once they come out of that, but like,
Right.
if you expect that to be a setup for success, you're asking a lot.
Thank you so much, fellow USC alumni. I was supposed to say that. Yay. All right. See you later. Bye.
We got actually one more, Aaron. We got time for some.
All good.
Cool. So Madiha, miss you, Madiha. She has a question for you. Are you able to get her in there?
All right. Hi, guys. Thank you, Derek, and thank you, Aaron, for joining us this evening. It's been such an awesome conversation. So I just wanted to ask, to conclude, having just graduated from the writing division, I was wondering what advice you have on how to approach entering the industry that is in such an uncertain, I guess, phase right now. And what would your best advice be to set myself and people in my same position for success? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a great question. I would say, the entertainment business at all times is a pretty uncertain business, so in a way, this is the best preparation you can have because, there's so many variables that you're going to have to navigate. What I would say at all times, the best advice is to make sure that you're improving your craft at all times. Use this time right now where production, may or may not start up anytime soon. If you're a director, get your reel ready, get it in shape. If you're a writer, make sure that you have as many samples ready to go as possible. If you're an editor, get your reel, any of the phases, make sure that you have your body of work in as great a shape as possible. And then I would say, in addition to the artistic side, you owe it to yourself from the business side to try to expand your network and your circle of people as much as possible. The great thing about COVID is that there is a certain equalizer in that you do, in theory, have access to people that you may not have had access to before. Now if you want to ask someone, if you could take them out to coffee, it no longer requires a drive to a certain part of Los Angeles and, kind of disrupt the schedule. There's someone you want to pick their brain, you could possibly lobby for, 10 minutes of their time on Zoom, to ask them a few questions. You want to ask yourself on the business side, am I putting myself out there as an artist as much as possible? It's not just about representation, but 9 times out of 10, your first job or two will come from colleagues that whether it's classmates, former classmates, or those are people that you're kind of in a graduating class, if you will, as you are looking for jobs. And so right now, to have your craft ready to go for the opportunities that you might encounter, and then to put yourself in a position where you'll be able to increase the number of possible opportunities that might be out there, meaning people that know what you want to do and know what you're interested in, people that have your best interests at heart, or can mutually benefit from what you're doing. You want to look at meeting people, nurturing those connections. I would say look to meet people who are doing what you want to do. And you never know where a mentor or a colleague or collaborator can come from. And if I were right now coming out of film school with official production a little ways off, perhaps, I would be using my time as much as possible to try to build up those circles. In addition to, again, perfecting my craft.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Aaron, also, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your insight. Super grateful that you're willing to come back and speak with us.
Thanks for having me, Derek. It is always a pleasure. I always enjoy. Great questions, and I hope it was helpful.
Definitely was.
It was amazing. I thought it was a really compelling conversation. And as Derek said, Aaron, thank you so much for your insight and also sharing your experiences with everybody. Derek, as always, thank you for moderating. You ask great questions. I appreciate it. And for everyone else out there, please check your email to see the other Our Voices panels that we'll be having all throughout the summer and into the fall. So thank you and good night.